Thank you all for joining my session. I'm Jan de Vries. I'm a cloud solution architect for a small consulting company based in the Netherlands, where I do a lot of Azure stuff. I see a lot of, companies struggling with stuff like Azure migrations or scaling globally. And during these consultant projects, I come across a lot of microservices solutions. And I want to tell you what I've seen and what you shouldn't do and what you should do. As you might guess, the conclusion is start with a monolith. So let's get that out of the way. Because most of the time people think we need global scale, we need to scale infinitely and do microservices because, well, it was the hype like 3 years ago. So we have to do something with it. But do you actually need to do it? Because how big are your teams and how many teams do you have? Most companies I've worked for, most of the time only have about 2 to 8 development teams. When you have 8 development teams, it might make sense to do different applications and not one big massive application. But if you only have like 2 development teams or 3 or 4, does it actually make sense to create dozens and dozens of services? It might, but most of the time that's not the case, because when, well, distributing all of your logic, all of your applications across multiple services, there's a lot of pain, and each developer, each team member needs to work in a specific way in order to get a cohesive system. So consider this when starting out. When you think you need to do microservices, well, should you start with it because it's rather complex? And if you only have like 10 developers, 20, 30 developers, does it make sense? Because will you get the advantages of microservices? Most of the time, not. So why microservices? Why should you use microservices? Well, if you do need the scale like Netflix and Spotify and stuff like this, it might actually make sense to do it, but most of the time, most projects I've been involved in are just forms over data, and most forms over data systems don't actually need 50 services doing their own little thing. You can just use, well, I'm a .NET guy, so you can just use some Angular SPA or some MVC framework and use some ORM to store data in a database. So it doesn't make sense all the time for such applications. So only if you need scaling and the advantages of microservices, you should go for microservices. But start out with a monolith, because a monolith, well, will stand the test of time. Most monoliths I've come across are like started developing the people 10, 20 years ago, and it's still running. The code might not be that pretty, but it's still running and it's doing what the business wants, or at least the business has, learned to work with this solution. So it will stand the test of time, and if you start out with a monolith now, you will probably still have it running like 5 years from now. Compared to microservices, they're rather brittle, or they can be rather brittle. So if you do something wrong, everything falls down and, well, no one can work with it. So that's one major disadvantage of having microservices. I haven't come across a microservice solution, a proper microservice solution yet. Or, well, I've seen a couple, but they're only like 6 months old. So the people haven't learned the disadvantages yet, and they aren't maintaining it for a couple of years now. So most are still very brittle and easy and quite error prone, but well, it's a decision. Like I mentioned, most services, most solutions I've seen are like a Jenga tower. If you change one service, you have a pretty high chance all of it will fall down, unless you design it properly, of course. because when designing your microservices or your monolith properly, things won't fall down. It will just work. But how should you start designing? Well, like I mentioned, you should start with a monolith because most of the time this is good enough for the customer or for your product owner or stakeholders or whatever, because most solutions we're creating don't need the global scale from day one. You might need it a year from now, but you probably don't need it when going live in production from day one. Unless you're creating Disney Plus, of course, then you want global scale from day one. But I don't think any of us over here has been in the development team of Disney Plus or Netflix or Spotify. So things to consider.